So we've all heard about the card that set Matrox up for a timely death, but today why don't we take a look at the card that actually caused them to bite the bullet? So this right here is the Matrox Parhelia, the last card Matrox ever actually got to make. But before we jump into the specs of this one, we've actually got to understand a little bit of the story behind it. Either way, I'll link my previous video I've made up above or down below, whatever it is YouTube actually lets you do. Anyways, for those of you that aren't going to click on that link, let me take you back for a whole 30 seconds to the start of the decade. Either way, Matrox was a company that made graphics cards, much like AMD and Nvidia nowadays, and they were the big shots for high quality output graphics cards. In other words, graphics cards that could display a pretty picture with analog signals. They also had support and features being something that would add to their niche. However, rumours ended up going out that they were going to release a gaming card. Pretty solid stuff. However, they ended up releasing a near complete rehashing of the same card. And well, mindshare is one thing that can really cripple a company, and despite Matrox telling people that it was indeed not a graphics card for gaming, some people did actually buy it for gaming, which is the story in the last video I made on them. Either way, it didn't speak a lot for the company's gaming prowess, meaning that when they actually went on to release a gaming graphics card, well, that's what we're going to find out now. Dawn of the year 2002, and things have been well slow in terms of competition from Matrox. While ATI and Nvidia duke it out hard with the Radeon 8000 and GeForce 3 series, Nvidia was already quick to capitalise in on the new year with the release of a GeForce 4 series. Now, the last time Matrox had anything to release to the market, it was in 2001, and even then, it was based on an architecture to go up against the GeForce 2, so yeah, quite a while had elapsed. ATI and of course Nvidia were also developing pretty decent technology for workplaces, and their current lineups could do workplace tasks pretty well, and they had decent graphical acceleration if you needed it. And they could do it all without needing to be a rehash of a rehash like what Matrox had to offer. In other words, all Matrox had to offer was support. However, Nvidia was doing pretty good in that as well. During the beginning of the year though, it became clear that maybe the hiatus from Matrox wasn't all it seemed. What if they were actually developing something that could be competitive? Something that could do it all, something like the competition for once? And this was of course the Matrox Parhelia, the last card they were ever going to make. Releasing in early 2002 at $399 US, it was asking top tier money, which already set the premise pretty high, and considering their reputation for gaming was already tainted by their last release, people actually believed in them a little bit. A lot of reviewers were quite hopeful that Matrox might actually have something to offer, because they actually confirmed this card might be for gaming, something that, you know, they hadn't actually properly confirmed before. It had only been rumours, and it was something that maybe the competition didn't have, feature sets. But we'll get into that later on. Really what we need to get to grips with is what people saw when it did release, so we can understand what happened. We have here a release version of the Matrox Parhelia, and it is a huge improvement over the last card they had released. 16 texture units, 4 pixel shaders, 4 vertex shaders, 4 TMUs and 4 ROPs. However, the main downside was this sounds really beefy, and it sounds like a really good card, but it's not fully DirectX 9 compliant. And that is one area where the card falls through because it doesn't have proper Shader Model 3 support. So really, it's a hugely beefed up DirectX 8.1 graphics card. And I know this isn't something we usually get the chance to talk about on the channel, but one thing it did get praised by is the build quality of the card. It's really impressive. Even reviewers of the day gave a lot of praise to the hardy qualities of the card, especially its power delivery, which it needed, as this was a big heatsink for the early 2000s. Honestly, some reviewers recommended you upgrade your case's cooling capacities to make way for the Matrox Parhelia. Either way, it was a monumental upgrade, but it was let down by low clocks, only around 200 MHz, and the competition was usually clocked about 250 to 350 MHz. So all those transistors and those architectural improvements can only do so much if your card can't reach the speeds the competitors can with just a clock speed increase. But there's that word, competitors. See, that's one big difference between Matrox and its competitors. Matrox didn't have shareholders to answer to, they didn't have anyone to push them into other markets, kind of forcefully. So for the years ATI and Nvidia were dominating the market to please their shareholders, It went well for them. They managed to survive. In fact, they're still around today in some form or another. But Matrox, with the Parhelia, they were trying to push somewhere to get into a market where everyone else was trying to get into it a good 3 to 5 years prior. They were making a battle when everyone else had already fought it and was already ready to fight another one. In other words, to keep the company making consumer graphics cards, the Parhelia had to expand into a market that was sort of becoming one giant blob of graphics card sales. The niche market was getting smaller, competition was getting fierce in the workplace, they needed something to enter the gaming market, so they were battling on all fronts. But could this card do it? Well, no. Let me give you some perspective here. Nvidia was absolutely killing it back in this era. The GeForce 4 series was a huge success, with stable drivers, plenty of game support, and chart-topping performance. So much so that the Parhelia on release was turning up bottom of the barrel in most reviewers' benchmarks. Now, don't get me wrong, the card was a formidable beast. It had a lot of power tucked away, and it could brute force itself well into some titles. The problem is, those some titles didn't exist, because what the card was best at, the card couldn't do back in this era. See, that's the problem. Why would you buy a graphics card that can't run what you need it to in the here and now? One of the most prominent tests for the graphics cards of the era was Unreal Tournament 2003, which actually supported one of the Parhelia's best points, quad-textured pixels. The problem is very few textures actually use these. At least not enough to give the card any headway in terms of benchmarks, meaning most cards from ATI and Nvidia were able to brute force their way into running better, as they were often clocked 50 to 100 MHz higher than the Parhelia. So the card was a mediocre choice at best if you were a gamer, but Matrox still had the chart-topping image quality for your monitor. But ATI and Nvidia, well, they weren't silly. They'd been improving their output quality the entire time Matrox was out of the game. However, there was a big turning point for Matrox. Although Nvidia and of course ATI still had the edge in raw performance, Matrox had one thing that they were very good at: features. And we all know that Matrox, well, they love to bundle in features even if you aren't going to use them. And they did actually hit the nail on the head for once. It actually did help to boost sales of the graphics card with Fragment AA, a custom form of anti-aliasing that you could force on in the drivers. Yep, the best part about it, hardly any performance loss even at 16 times. So it did become a compelling option. Why not drop the resolution on the Matrox card, turn on the anti-aliasing, it's going to look pretty decent either way, and that lower resolution can help you claw back some of the much needed performance in terms of frame rate. Hell, the card even had super sampling. We're talking about a card developed nearly 2 decades ago that's able to run whatever you want forced on in the drivers with super sampling. That is a pretty great feature right there. So yay, everything's going well for Matrox. They've actually got a few sales going and they've got the best feature set but slightly worse performance. However, if you're a gamer with some money, those features do look compelling, and it has got raw power enough to keep it relevant in the future. Or does it? For the few months that the Matrox card did actually enjoy some success, it was short-lived, by possibly one of the most devastating releases that could have happened, at least if you were Matrox. ATI released the 9000 series of graphics cards, and for anyone that already knows that name, you already know what happens. The mid-range cards were better. The image output quality was near enough it could match Matrox. And worst of all, it actually cost less. You know, it was game over for Matrox. What was a victory for ATI knocked them completely out of the market. There was no point buying the Parhelia for niche features with the 9000 series around. And so ends our story. This card may have been one failed bit of silicon from a marketing perspective, but compared to their previous cards, this was one that legitimately amazed me. This was their first card where they actually said, this is one for gamers, this is one for the workplace. This was one final bang to actually do something that ATI and Nvidia were already doing. This is the first time we've seen Matrox ever push the boundaries out of the workplace market and say they are doing so. Either way, I've been using and living with this card for a little while now to get an idea of just how good it is, or how bad it is, and I've pretty much managed to push this card to its utmost limits. And honestly, I think the results are going to surprise you. We'll be testing today with this little test system that I've just put together with 2GB of RAM, a Pentium 4 Northwood processor, all running on the latest version of Windows XP. Oh, and that's one thing this Matrox card is going for it. Virtually any operating system you can think of, you can throw onto it. It will just take it and it'll have drivers. But what exactly is the Parhelia experience? Now, I'm using the latest drivers available for the card, at least the best performing ones, as the drivers did include some optimizations late into the life and were stable, which is the big kicker to mention, as by this point in its life, the only thing Matrox could really count on to even shift the cards they'd made was the insane support library, which they still have on their website today. In fact, the website actually loaded in Internet Explorer 7 or whatever it was that came with XP, but that's besides the point. Why don't we throw some games and tasks at this thing and see exactly what it does? So, starting things up relatively simple for the card, we have the Elder Scrolls Morrowind, a huge title that utilised real-time shadows, I know, very fancy, and although not the best looking game in existence, the water and particle effects can be very taxing on a graphics card and do look surprisingly nice. Now, it's worth keeping in mind that I do think that Matrox's anti-aliasing really does add to the image quality that we're seeing on screen, and I have enabled it across all the benchmarks you're going to see, as it didn't have any performance hit. This is one of the reasons to buy this card, because of the anti-aliasing. Either way, I think we can all agree, Morrowind, pretty good experience. Although we don't often think of Halo Combat Evolved as being a taxing game once again, it certainly has its areas where it can be very taxing, and those are usually the particle effects and things like that, which could bring the game to a crawl. But seeing the game run with very nice anti-aliasing, fully playable on the system, in fact I did test multiplayer for a little bit as well, it's really surprising to see how well this game runs. And it is also a pretty nice, accurate system from the era this game would have came out in. In fact, it didn't throw up any errors whatsoever relating to starting on the card, something that a few games could do. Now, for the crisis of its day, it was Far Cry 1, and well, that was definitely a crisis. I tried a few different drivers, I tried every version of the game up to 1.4, I even started tweaking around with the configuration file for well on a few hours, and this was one of the more common issues you'd run into with a Matrox card. Unlike ATI and of course Nvidia, where you can find everything documented about this, and usually there'll be driver updates, in fact there'll usually be compatibility listings in the game's files for your graphics card, Matrox isn't even on the support list, and this wasn't exactly very long into the card's lifeline, and they'd already forgotten about it. Still, you could probably try and get the game working. I know I've dealt with this issue before, but none of the usual fixes did work, and I'd imagine this is down to a lack of any real DirectX 9 support. But I said this card was built for the future, didn't I? And you would indeed be correct. How many cards from the turn of the century can you fire up Windows 7, install the drivers, which of course are still easily accessible, then fire up Steam and start running games? Now, I'm not saying you can't work around this with some of the Nvidia and ATI cards of the era, but with Matrox, it was just double-clicking the drivers and it was all done. They all installed, no issues whatsoever, and I actually found this very impressive. Now, titles like Half-Life 2, that's right, Half-Life 2, launched and ran perfectly fine. Even though this is a newer version of the game that I would have liked to have tested, an older version would likely have ran in a higher resolution or ran better, we were playing with a nice mixture of low, medium and high settings depending on what the card was best at, and all in all, the game could suffer some dips, especially in the area where I like to benchmark this is a very taxing large area, but the card is running the game, and I don't think many people have ever tested this. Other Source games running on older versions of the engine, like CS Source, could tax the game with their multiplayer elements, but did also run okay. They ran very nicely. And that's right, some fellas on a game of Counter-Strike Source, we were running around Dust 2 having to deal with me as a teammate using a Matrox graphics card, and I made sure to let them all know. Still an impressive showing for a card that gave up the ghost a good few years ago, before this game even came out. Yet alone the fact that I'm out here playing it in 2020. So the Matrox card, yeah, it's still doing alright. Now, I'll admit, I didn't have very high hopes for this game running at all, but I will give credit to the game's optimizations and the card for being able to run it. Fable the Lost Chapters with a lowered resolution, but still a decently high one, and some lowered settings, but still some okay settings in place with anti-aliasing, ran really nicely. I just ran around the main starting area, Oakvale, and we saw very few frame drops, as this area can tend to be quite taxing in the town centre, and usually is one area where cards struggle. However, we only saw slight dips below 30 FPS, but still very playable on the Matrox card. So I don't know about you, but that didn't seem half bad at all to me. In fact, it was quite impressive. Up until you remember that cards released just a few months after this were able to run things better than this, and they were able to run things like Crysis. In fact, the Radeon 9000 series can play Crysis, this can't. Still, one other area the card really holds its own is super sampling. Now, it's really hard for me to capture this with the technology I have access to, as I don't exactly have the best capturing equipment in the world, but take a quick look at this demo of the Source engine running with super sampling enabled and without super sampling enabled. It looks almost too good to be true, and yes, it is a taxing feature to use on the card, but it's not as taxing as you'd imagine it to be. All in all, it's got a drop-down menu on the drivers that, although with a Windows XP aesthetic, is very similar to what AMD and Nvidia are offering with their respective driver menus nowadays, but Matrox were doing it 20 years earlier. Not that it really warrants saying, but the card was brilliant for displaying things on. It's got a high color mode, and especially in tasks like video editing, I saw no visible slowdown and everything was displayed in a very crisp resolution. Talking about resolutions though, one final trick the card had up its sleeve was a multi-monitor style thing, sort of like AMD's Eyefinity, but years before it became a thing. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you as I don't have the breakaway cables I'd need or 3 matching monitors, but I believe Phil from Phil's Computer Lab has a great video demonstrating it and some more age-appropriate benchmarks, so that's really worth watching. Awesome stuff there, and a really interesting feature that I think they might have sold on in 2005, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough. There were plans for a Matrox Parhelia 2, but by the time it became clear that the company had no place at all in the gaming market, and with the competition growing in their workplace sector, it became time to knuckle down and accept that niche support was the maximum they were ever going to grow. They weren't ever going to be the giants like ATI or Nvidia. They eventually upgraded support to AGP 8 times and PCI-E for the Parhelia, but at that stage it didn't really help performance. It was more about providing options to sell the chips that they already had made, to give people that actually did need the cards a reason to buy them. Really, that was the end of focusing on consumers. No more competition with ATI or Nvidia. It was goodbye from Matrox. Or was it? Well, they are still around today, but with a few niche releases from this point onwards that were never intended for consumer sales, this was the last big release, the one last hurrah, the Matrox Parhelia. 6 years ago in 2014, it was announced that they were licensing AMD's GCN architecture for a few releases, but at that stage, is it really a Matrox card anymore? Well, yes, it's Matrox, but not the same way the Parhelia was. Anyway, I did really enjoy my time with the card. It's just a shame, you know. I really thought Matrox could have done better, but, you know, against the Radeon 9000 series, that's all you have to say. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching. I've really enjoyed making this video. I've been dealing with 25 kilobits per second internet, and as I sit here recording this voiceover, I have no internet due to a tree knocking out my phone line. So I hope you've all enjoyed. This has been very difficult to make. Good night. So there we have it, the Matrox Parhelia story. If you want more videos like this, you can always like and subscribe. It took me a long time to make, to get all the research down, get a hold of the card, and it has been very interesting. So I'd like to bring this card back some more, maybe a retro gaming PC build. But anyway, I'll catch you guys in the next one.